the cost theorem. So of course that was with the help of an example. So let's go to the diagram first. So this is the diagram wherein we have tried to show that it's a kind of paper mill dumping the waste into the river, and the fishermen community is being affected. And we tried to show that, you see, if the output is reduced from the overproduction to the optimal level from the point of view of fishermen community, then the reduction in the consumers and producer surplus is given by the triangle SCE, whereas the benefit for the fishermen is given by the area under the rectangle ABCE. Since ABCE is higher than SCE, so that's why it is beneficial for the fishermen to actually compensate for the loss of the consumers and producer surplus, which is equivalent to SCE. And after that also he will be in a position to enjoy benefit of ABC. So in that case, he will try to bribe or compensate for the loss of this consumers or producer surplus by the paper producer. So for that, actually, to understand that, let's have a look at the consumer surplus, producer surplus. Now, in case of consumer surplus, basically it is coming from the consumer. So demand is obviously the issue out here. So we'll have a look at the demand curve. So, so as you know, it's a kind of two-dimensional diagram where in the x-axis we have the quantity, in the y-axis we have the price. Now we draw the demand curve. So this is the demand curve. So demand curve, for example, it has met the y-axis in the line E at the point E. So it is a kind of sloping curve towards the right, negatively sloped curve. So let us assume that at a particular point of the demand curve, we try to find out the demand. Suppose M is the point where we try to find out the demand and corresponding quantity demanded, how much quantity of the product is being demanded by the consumers. If that happens, corresponding to that M, we'll find two things because it's a two-dimensional diagram. So, so you'll find just a minute. Yeah, just a minute. Sorry. So at M point, let us try to find out what will be the quantity demanded. So corresponding to M, so what we find, there are two things. One is in the y-axis, which is the price. And at price P, the quantity demanded will be around OQ. So that is the demand, quantity demanded corresponding to this demand curve at point M. So now here, the issue is that at every point of the demand curve, the consumer is prepared to pay the price, corresponding price. For example, if he wants to get something above M or maybe at less than quantity O, the price that he is prepared to pay is higher than OP. Okay, for the entire person. So in the EM range, he is prepared to pay higher price for lesser amount of the output. But when he finally ends up demanding quantity OQ, he is paying an uniform price of OP. So that means the portion above P, below the demand curve, basically the triangle EMP, represents the total of the excess that the consumer is prepared to pay, but he is not paying, as he is paying, or he is ending up by paying OP amount for total quantity of OQ amount. So that triangle, that area, the summation of that value actually, that represents the consumer's surplus. So in the diagram, you will find, so this shaded portion is nothing but the consumer surplus. This is the portion which actually the consumer is prepared to pay for the product, but he is not required to pay that much because the price is somewhat different. It's lower than what he is actually prepared to pay. So this is consumer surplus, right? So if the producer, if the consumer procures the commodity, means the quantity of which is around OQ, will be enjoying a consumer surplus of, suppose, triangle EPM or PEM, something like that. So similarly, you can have the concept of producer surplus. Similar thing, only thing is that since it is production, so it will be coming from production sector. So so supplies will be coming from the production. The supply curve is given as an upward sloping curve. So basically saying that the more quantity will be made available by the supplier when the price of the product is higher. The relationship between quantity supplied and the price of the product is positive. So higher the price, higher will be the quantity offered for sale by the seller. But at the same time, at every point of this curve, this supply curve, the supplier is ready to supply something at different prices. But if we assume that the supplier has decided to supply at the level of M, so he has decided to supply OQ amount at the level of at point M, and the price that he will be getting at that for that quantity will be around OP. Now the issue here is, you see, so although he is getting OP price for the entire range of product from O to Q, but actually he was prepared to sell the product at lesser prices, the product which is lesser than OQ quantity. Okay, so along this line, CM line, actually he is prepared to sell the product at lesser price, but since he has ended up selling the product equivalent to OQ, he is getting an uniform price OP. So the portion, so the revenue that he is getting is actually equivalent to the area under the triangle OPMQ. Okay, so that is the revenue that he is getting. But actually, he is prepared to get, or he is ready to accept a revenue of OCMQ because his price is decided by or defined by his selling curve or supply curve. But this supply curve, okay, basically actually is actually not entirely this rectangle OPMQ, rather it's a portion of that rectangle only. So in that sense, the total revenue that he is getting by selling the product at OP price, so that is a little bit higher than he is actually prepared to get. So that is that additional amount, which is nothing but the area of the triangle CPM. So that is the producer surplus. Okay, I hope this is clear to you. Now, at the equilibrium position, when the market comes to an equilibrium, when the supply curve meets the demand curve, so we decide on an equilibrium quantity on equilibrium price. So at that position, what is the consumer surplus and producer surplus? Let's have a look. This is the diagram. So this is consumer surplus. You see the demand curve and the supply curve, they have intersected at the point M. The equilibrium quantity is OQ and equilibrium price decided is OP. So at this price, if you look at, you see the consumers will be having some consumer surplus, which is shown by the blue shaded portion. Similarly, the producers will also be enjoying some producer surplus, which is shown in the form of red shaded portion in red. So this is, if you totally top, then consumer surplus and producer surplus, that will give you the total surplus for consumers as well as the producers. Okay. Now, in the case of cost theorem, basically we are talking about that only. Now, what happens? Suppose the quantity, as of now, quantity decided by the market is suppose OQ. And suppose the quantity has to be reduced by looking for enhancing the societal welfare at large, because the fishermen community will be affected when the output is more. So then what will happen? The OQ amount will be reduced. It might come down towards the left hand side. it might become OQ1 or something like that. So in that case, obviously, when the output is reduced from OQ towards the left hand side of Q, then obviously there will be some reduction in the consumers and producer surplus. So some amount of consumers and producer surplus will be at stake. That is the thing what is talked about in the case of cost theorem. Let's see what it is. So you just see here initially the market forces will decide on the quantity to be OQ, but since that will affect the welfare of the fishermen community, so they will expect that the output is reduced to OQ1. So if that happens, okay, there will be some reduction in the producers and consumer surplus. What is that reduction? The amount is okay given by the shaded portion. So AEC, the area under the triangle AEC, that might be the consumers and producer surplus, which will be reduced as a result of reduction of the output from OQ to OQ1. But since this value is less than ABCE value, ABCE is the will be the gain or benefits for the fishermen when the output is reduced from OQ to OQ1. So obviously ABCE value is higher than ACE value. So as a result of which the fisherman will be in a better position, even if he or she compensates for the loss of this consumers and producer surplus to the paper producers. Okay, so he'll be in a position to gain. So that's why he will be interested in bribing the paper mill owner so that he reduces the amount of paper production from OQ to OQ1. So that is the private deal, which might actually result in kind of restoring optimality in the production process. So here there is no issue of kind of intervention by the government out there. That is the crux of cost theorem. Of course, there are issues regarding kind of property rights, the party to whom the property rights will be assigned. There will be issues of transaction cost, distribution of income from one party to another. So those things will be there, obviously. But the fact is that there is a possibility to have optimality or maybe allocative efficiency in the case of even in the presence of externality without the intervention of the government. So that is what is shown by the cost theorem. Of course, there are certain limitations. We tried to see those limitations as well yesterday. So mostly the issue is that under the situation of externality, the market forces will not give the correct signal. So the market will not be providing the efficient allocation of resources. So market will fail. Okay, so there has to be certain sort of kind of solutions. The solutions are given in two forms: the government intervention or maybe the private. Okay. The next thing is the issue of non-exclusion. Non-exclusion is also considered to be another reason for market failure. Now here, it is extremely difficult for anybody to exclude somebody from using a particular resource. So normally in case of environmental assets or resources, it happens so. The product or maybe the asset is already available. And in the case of non-exclusion, it is extremely difficult to deny somebody the access to the environmental asset. That happens sometimes. So if we talk about a public park, for example, if not an environmental asset, so a park is being created. Once it is created, so everybody will have the access to that. A road is constructed. Once the road is constructed, so everybody can make use of the road. A bridge is being constructed, so that once the bridge is being made available to the people, so everybody can have access to the bridge. So these are some of the things where you cannot exclude anybody from making use of the resource or the asset. So in the case of environmental assets, also similar thing. If something like a river is there, the people can have access to the river water. Okay, so unless there is some kind of intervention by the owner, by the person or the agency who has the rights over the resource. For example, in the case of fishing in a river, so normally it is a kind of non-excludable kind of a thing. But even then, so what happens? The government, who is considered to be having the rights over the river, so they will be giving the rights to certain groups of people. Okay, for a particular stretch of the river, a particular group of people might be given the license or permission to catch fish. So that type of a thing happens. And if it so happens, then we can say that the non-exclusion property is being kind of, it no longer remains a non-exclusionary kind of a resource. It can be made exclusionary also. Because for other people who do not have the right to catch fish in the stretch of the river, they will not be having the access to the resource. But in general, unless it is erected, this type of restriction is erected, so the resources might be available to each and everybody. So what happens if there is non-exclusionary characteristics? So in many cases, we find that although the resources are accessible to each and everybody, but they might be rival in character. So we'll try to understand these things a little bit later. So rivalry in consumption basically means that once a particular resource or good or service is being used by somebody, then the amount available for someone else gets reduced. For example, if you think about groundwater, now if I want to have drinking water from the groundwater resource, what I can do, I can install a groundwater lifting device, and I can get water from the groundwater. But once I extract water, the amount which will be available for my neighbor will get reduced, because ultimately it's a common thing. It's not that my groundwater is kind of different from the groundwater which my neighbor will be extracting from the underground reserve. It's not actually. It's a contiguous kind of resource. So the same resource is available for my neighbor also. So in that case, what happens? Although it might be kind of non-exclusionary kind of a thing, but it will be rival in consumption. We say that rivalry in consumption is the characteristics when, so once the resource is being used by somebody, the amount available for other people will be lesser and lesser. In that case, it will be rivalry in consumption. For example, if we talk about our pair of shoes. So if it is, if I wear a pair of shoes, it cannot be worn by somebody else. Or in a sense, you can say that it's a rivalry in consumption because others cannot have the same amount. Okay, something like that. So in the case of presence of non-exclusion, but with rivalry in consumption, what will happen? People will find incentive to capture the goods as soon as possible before anyone else captures them. Because it so happens that if you know that it is a kind of rival in consumption, basically it means if somebody makes the first use of the resource, so he will get the maximum benefits out of the resource. And once it is being used by somebody, the amount available for others will not be there at all. So in that case, what will happen? There will be a tendency for anybody to capture or make use of the resource at the very beginning. So as a result of which, a concept which was popularized later on by Garrett Hardin, when he talked about this concept as the tragedy of the commons, which was published in 1968. So the market forces fail to signal the true scarcity value of the resource in this case, in the case of non-exclusion and rivalry in consumption. So in that case, if nobody can be denied, so there will be overuse of the resources because people will take into account only their own individual benefits and the cost. They will not look into the externality, so which will be there in the use of the resource. As a result of that, the resource gets exhausted too soon than it should have been. So that is the concept of the tragedy of commons, which we'll be trying to look at a little bit later when we talk about the economics of natural resources again. So in the case of natural resources, a number of conceptual things regarding property rights are used. So in this case, when we are talking about this open access kind of a thing, open access basically means, so we'll come to that. When we are talking about this resources which are held in common, the environmental resource, for example, so it might be considered as commons. Commons basically means common pool resources. Common pool resources means which are available in common. Okay, so environmental resource, the river, the wetland, the forest. So all those things might be even air, might be considered to be commons, okay, or maybe common pool resources. But whenever there is a kind of assignment of some kind of property rights over the commons or maybe resources, so then we find the concept of common property resources. Whenever a community has been assigned some kind of property rights over the common pool resources, we can consider this to be as common property resources. It's a property right regime that allows members of a group or collective body to use the asset and devise rules to exclude non-members from using the resource. So this is a very important thing, and in fact, there have been a lot of studies nowadays regarding this common property resources, and also by different countries. Different countries have been trying to go for this type of means have gone for devising rules and regulations for managing these common property resources. So in case of India, if you look into, so you will find that there is a concept called joint forest management. So this was basically the concept which was brought in in around 1988. So when this joint forest management concept was brought in by the Ministry of Forest, Environmental Forest. So basically, it means that the people living in the nearby vicinities of the forest, so they will be involved in the process of conservation and management of the forest. Now, as you know, forest is a resource for conservation of which you require cooperation from many people. The forest fringe villagers normally make use of the forest resources. For example, there are a lot of non-timber forest products. They might be using it as a source of fuel, as fodder. So many things are there. So for grazing also, so they might be using. So, so it was felt that these people should be made part of the conservation process, and in return, actually, they will also be getting some benefits out of this. Normally, that is the practice. Forest fringe dwellers, they collect a number of things from the forest for their own survival, because these are normally very poor people. So they get a large chunk of their required goods and services from the forest. So if they are made part of the management system, then probably they will be knowing it better, and they will be in a better position to find out ways of conserving the resource. So that was the idea. So that is how joint forest management concept came into being in India, or came into person in India. So basically here, the community will be given certain responsibilities. In a sense, you can say the rights over the resource will be given to a group of people or members of a group. So the members of the group will be able to get benefits out of the resource out there, but non-members will not have access to the resource. So that way, you are trying to, that way, in fact, this concept tries to restrict the use of the resources. So it tries to restrict the use of the resources to the members of the group only. Okay, so that is the concept of common property resources. That might be there for not only for forest, but also for groundwater. It might be for river water, and so many other things are there. Mostly in case of environmental resources, we find many examples of common property resources. Another concept, which is in the just previous slide we were talking about, of degradation of the natural resources because of kind of tendency of the people to make the first use of the resource. So that is related to the concept of open access resource. When you talk about open access resources, it's unlike common property resources. In the case of common property resources, there will be a group of people who will be actually allowed, or maybe they are the members, so who are given the responsibility of conserving the resource. So they'll be having the rights of use of the resource, and also the rights or maybe the responsibility of preserving the resource, be it groundwater, be it forest, be it wasteland, be it wetland. So those things are the responsibilities of the group. But in the case of open access resources, actually nobody owns it, and everybody has the access to the resource. So it's something like that. It's not common property resource as such. It's a kind of open access resources. So where anybody and everybody can make use of the resource. So if that happens, then obviously people know that if they do not make the first use of the resource, so their benefits will be lesser, because other people will be trying to capture or get the maximum benefit out of that. So there will be a tendency to make first use of the resources without looking into the other issues. So as a result of which, the resource might get degraded. And there are ample examples of this nature in the case of degradation of natural resources, in the case of grazing land, in the case of wetland, and so many other things. And in the case of environmental resources, particularly renewable resources, when you talk about, so although we know that renewable resources will be regenerating over a period of time, but at the same time, renewable resources should also have a kind of basic minimum amount of resources available so that it can regenerate. So extraction rate, if it is higher than the regeneration rate, obviously the resources might exhaust, even if it is renewable resource. So that is another issue. So here in the case of open access resources, there is a probability that the resource gets degraded very quickly. So in the case of non-exclusion, again, the markets will not be there because you are not in a position to exclude anybody. Property rights may not be there. So if property rights are not there, you cannot exclude anybody. You cannot charge a price. If you cannot charge a price, basically you mean to say that the resource is abundantly available. The scarcity value of the resource is not recognized. So in that case, the markets will not be able to allocate the resources properly. Market fails. So this is another issue, source of market failure. The next issue is the source of market failure in the public goods. Now, in the case of public goods, basically public goods are related with the concept of a non-exclusion and as well as a non-rivalry. In fact, public goods are those goods and services for which some kind of publicness is there. So when you say publicness, there are two concepts actually. One concept is, as we have already discussed, the non-exclusion concept, and the another is the non-rivalry concept. Both the things are already more or less explained a little bit. In the case of non-rivalry, the idea is that you see a resource is something like this where the amount is equally available for everybody. So if somebody makes use of the resource, the amount available for other people will also be equally available. So for example, a road, I'm riding on my bicycle, another person is also riding on the bicycle. The amount of the road available to me is same with the amount available to the other motorist or maybe motorcyclist. So it's something like that. The park, I am going to a park, you are also going to a park. So the amount of park available to me and you are the same. So my consumption of the park is not rival to your consumption of the park. So if we have these type of resources, we can say that this is non-rival in consumption. But in most of the cases, we find goods and services where consumption is rival in nature. In the case of non-excludability, already we have discussed it. So if there is a possibility of excluding somebody from making use of the resource, then it is a kind of excludable resource. And if it's extremely costly or difficult to exclude somebody from making use of the resource, then it is non-excludable. In the case of road, if it is built already, the additional cost of providing the road to other person will be zero. In essence, you can say that the marginal cost of supplying the good to an additional individual, because you do not have to again create it, no? So it's already available. So that's why there is no additional cost. So we say that the marginal cost of supplying the good to another individual will be zero, or maybe to an additional individual will be zero. So in that case, you see, so this is a non-excludable resource in essence. Although we say these two things are there, non-rivalry, good is available to all, and one person's consumption doesn't reduce another person's consumption. The marginal cost of supplying the good to an additional individual is zero. Now, in the case of public goods, you see, if both these conditions are satisfied, non-rivalry and non-excludability, then you consider a particular good to be pure public goods. Okay, if something is non-rival in consumption and non-excludable, then we consider this to be pure public goods. But all public goods cannot be pure public goods. In many cases, it might so happen that they have the non-excludability characteristics, but they might be rival in character. For example, the groundwater resources that we talked about. So you cannot exclude anybody from using the groundwater because as the law goes, the groundwater below your land belongs to you. So that's why you can make use of that. Somebody else also can make use of the groundwater, so below his land. So, but at the same time, the amount available for the additional means other people will be lesser and lesser if everybody makes use of the resources simultaneously. So that's why this is, although it is non-excludable, it might be a rival in consumption. So if we have this type of goods and services where there is some kind of publicness, then we can consider them as the public goods. In the case of public goods, the issue is actually setting a proper price is a little bit difficult, because in the case of this type of public goods, there will be a lot of positive externalities, and these positive externalities means some benefits will be there, and these benefits are not taken into account while talking about the price of the public goods. So as a result of that, the markets or the prices will not reflect the true value of the resources or goods and services. So that's why there will be market failure out there. So we'll try to have a look into that, how it happens. Because in the case of private good, things are a little bit different. If I am consuming a piece of bread, the other person cannot consume the piece of bread. But in the case of public good, so the amount that I am making use of is the amount that you are also making use of. The same amount is available for everybody. So that is the problem out here. So that's why the actual benefit or actual positive benefit out of the resource cannot be captured properly by the market prices. We'll try to have a look at some other characteristics of goods and services. So let us categorize them into different types. For example, so we are having these two characteristics: rivalry, non-rivalry, exclusive, non-exclusiveness. I'm trying to actually categorize some of the goods and services according to these characteristics. For example, if I talk about a mobile handset, so in the case of mobile handset, it will be mostly the private good because it belongs to somebody. So it might be procured by an individual. So it will be a private good. So when he or she is owning the mobile handset, so he or she can exclude anybody else from making use of the mobile handset. So in that sense, it has the exclusive characteristics. At the same time, it is rival in nature also. Okay, so your mobile handset you are making use of, somebody else cannot make use of that, or in a sense, the amount available to others will be zero. It's not the equal. Okay, so that way, in fact, you can say that this is a kind of private good which has the characteristics of rivalness and exclusiveness. Similarly, the pair of shoes that you might be having, so it will have the same characteristics. It will be rival in consumption. At the same time, it will be exclusive as well. Now, other examples, for example, we are talking about fishing in a pond, for example, or maybe kind of wetland, or maybe a lake. So when you go for fishing, suppose anybody and everybody is allowed to go for fishing. So in that case, it's a non-exclusive characteristics of fishing. But at the same time, the amount of fish available in the pond or lake might be limited. So once the first users catch fishes, the amount available for other people will be lesser and lesser. So in that sense, it will be rival in consumption. Congested highways, we have given the example of highways. Okay, we have given the example of highways. Highways are normally considered to be non-rival in consumption. But if it is a congested highway, the amount of space available in the highway will be lesser and lesser. So that way, in fact, if we look into, so we find so different examples for different activities. Another example that we have tried to incorporate here is online computer services. Of course, it depends actually. In case of online computer services, what happens if the number of users of a particular computer service goes beyond a particular limit? The speed of the computer service or speed of the service might go down. So that way, in fact, the service becomes, the amount available to anybody or everybody might be different. So in this sense, we can say that these will be non-exclusive, but at the same time, they might be rival. Now, as an example of non-rival exclusive goods, it's a little bit difficult, but so textbooks give the example of this. When not in capacity, airline seats. So it's something like this. So if you have to enter into an airline, definitely you have to have kind of you have to pay something. So in a sense, it is exclusive in nature. But if it so happens that so it's not in capacity, the airline wants to fly at that time. Okay, so seats might be available. If seats are available, if it is not in capacity, then kind of providing seat to a person out there, so who has the right to go into the uh, flight. So that is possible. So in that case, what we can say is that my consumption of my use of the seats in the flight is not affecting the use of the seat by somebody else. So in that case, it is not rival in consumption. So that might be one example of kind of exclusive but non-rival nature of certain services. The other things, for example, national defense, street lights. You can talk about lighthouse also. So these are some of the examples which you can bring in. So in the case of national defense, what happens? We call them non-rival as well as non-exclusive. Non-exclusive in the sense that once the army is there in the border, the defense service that is being provided by the army will be equally same to each and every person. That means if somebody living in, for example, Punjab is getting that service, the same service is received by somebody in Tripura as well, or maybe for that matter in Uttar Pradesh also. So that way, in fact, it is non-exclusive. Nobody can be excluded from getting the services of the national defense. At the same time, it is non-rival. The amount of service that I am getting in Assam, for example, might be equal with someone who will be getting the service from defense in Kerala. So my consumption of defense services will not reduce the amount available for the person in Kerala. So that way, national defense is an example of non-rival and non-exclusive service. Street lights, for example, if street lights are on, the light is available for each and everyone which is nearer to the street light. So my consumption of the street light doesn't reduce the amount available for someone else. Okay, so I'm not so nobody can be excluded from making use of the street light. At the same time, the amount available for each and everybody will remain the same. If that is the case, this can also be termed as an example of non-exclusive and non-rival service. Similarly, sometimes people talk about the lighthouse, which might be used for the ships coming and going in a port. Okay, the lighthouse, if lighthouse is there, the light is visible for the ships approaching the port, and that will be equally available for each and every ship. So that way, in fact, it will be non-exclusionary. At the same time, it can be non-rival also. But of course, some of these things, services can be made exclusionary by way of imposing some kind of restriction. For example, in the case of lighthouse, so if it so happens that it sends a coded signal to the incoming ships, then of course the others who do not have any idea about the codes, okay, those who cannot decode that signal, then will not be able to kind of make use of that lighthouse signal. So in that case, it becomes kind of exclusive service. So there are ways actually where how we can make kind of services exclusionary. So we are talking about highways. Normally, we are talking about highways to be the public non-exclusionary kind of a service. But if it is a kind of toll gate, means that toll tax is to be given. So in that case, those who are paying the toll tax, they are allowed to ply on the highways. Others who are not paying the toll tax, they will not be allowed to ply on the highways. So that way, in fact, even the highway services are made exclusionary. So these are different types of services that we can talk about. And in fact, many of the services that we often come across will be having one or the other characteristics of these type of things. We talk about education. Another concept is being used sometimes. So that concept is merit goods. Merit goods. Education is considered to be a merit good, similar to public goods concept. The thing is that some of these public service, public goods, or many of these public public goods will be made available by the public sector or maybe by the government. Why is it so? Because if it is left to the private players, it so happens that the actual value of the public goods may not be properly reflected. As a result of that, lesser amount of the public goods might be made available. Okay, that is one thing. Of course, from the point of view of economics, there are certain other things also. So it so happens that the investment in certain projects like roads, highways, bridges, so this is very lumpy. At the same time, the gestation period is very high. Gestation period means, so you are investing today, the return will be coming after a few days. So that period is known as the gestation period. The gestation period is very high. So in that case, the returns will be coming after a long gap, and many private players may not be interested in that. But nowadays, of course, it's not like that. Many private players, big players, are engaged in providing these type of infrastructural facilities, building of port, building of airport, building of roads. So all those things are done by big private parties. But it is technically it is believed that so in the case of public goods and services, somehow if it is assessed by the private players, the correct amount may not be made available by the private player. So that is why it is mostly the domain of the government sector or maybe the public sector. Roads are mostly built by the government. Making use of the private sector, that's a different issue altogether. How many roads will be required? How many bridges will be required? Okay, so how many public parks should be made available? So this type of thing, decisions are taken by the public sector or maybe the government. In the case of education, what happens? So there are different stages in education. You have the primary education, secondary education, tertiary education. Now, education is again one such service, so which is very much essential for the human civilization. Now, sometimes it is believed that if it is left only to the private players, so this will not be sufficiently made available. So in that case, again, so this will have to be provided by the public sector or the government sector. But at the same time, there are a lot of private players. Now, since education is considered to be something which can tremendously influence human welfare, so it is believed that this should be equally available for everybody. Now, if it is left in the hands of the private players, so it might so happen that those who can afford to that private education will only be gaining out of that. So in that case, a certain section of the society will be left out. It will become a kind of exclusive kind of thing, which is not good from the point of view of societal welfare. So that way, in fact, education, although it's a kind of public good kind of a thing, where it has the characteristics of non-exclusionary as well as non-rivalry, but at the same time, since it has to be provided to everybody, so that's why, in fact, so there are provisions. The government intervenes, and government actually plays a very important role out here. So that way, in fact, it has got the. It is a little bit different from the conventional public goods concept. So that is why it's given different name like merit goods. Okay. Next, would like to have an idea about how much of public goods are to be provided in a society or in an economy. Now, it's basically because of the fact that public goods will be available in the same quantity for everybody. So it is different from the private goods. Private goods will be available in different quantities to different people. So that is why, while talking about the optimal provision of public goods, we need to find out so how much of public goods will be required, and whether, as we have been making statements that the public sector will be the right supplier of the public goods, whether that is correct or not. So we need to have a look into that as well. So for that, of course, I'll try to give you some example. You see, normally what happens, people do not make use only of public goods or only of private goods. They make use of both public goods as well as private goods. Now, private goods will be private. So if I am using a good, so somebody else is not getting that. So it is exclusive in nature. it is non-rival. It's rival in nature. But in the case of public goods, it might be non-excludable, non-rival. In the extreme case of publicness, if we talk about pure public goods, if we are talking about, so in that case, it will be available to each and everybody. For example, if we are talking about a kind of a road, if we are talking about a suppose public park, so it will be available to everybody. At the same time, the amount available to each and every person will remain the same. Okay. At the same time, if we are talking about optimal provisioning of public goods, we should also look into the fact that this optimality is a concept which is associated with allocative efficiency. Normally, we talk about this Pareto efficiency. So that basically means if there are a number of people, okay, so it will be impossible to increase the welfare of anybody without reducing the welfare of at least one person in that group or society. That is Pareto efficiency or Pareto optimality. Now, if we assume that there are only two people in the society who are actually deriving their benefits out of consumption of goods and services, some are private and some are public. In that case, so the optimality will be associated with maximization of the individual welfare of one, subject to the condition that okay, other person's welfare is not reduced. Or in a sense, you can say that both are the satisfaction of or maybe welfare of both the individuals are kind of a maximum kind of a thing. Both are happy with the way the distribution of goods and services are happening out there. So when you talk about that, so probably what we can think of is that so optimality might be possible when we try to maximize the satisfaction of one individual subject to the condition that the other individual's satisfaction is not reduced. So that might be one problem, optimality problem, the solution of which will help us in getting the conditions under which the public good will be optimally made available. We'll try to have a look at this with the help of a similar example. Probably we can take up this in the next class. So in the meanwhile, I'll be sending you some materials on this public goods part. I'd like to stop here for today. If you have any question, I can take it up. Is there any question from anybody? No question? So in that case, let me tell you one more thing. So yesterday was the last date of course adjustment. As I could see, around 84 people were there in the course. Now, since now onwards, there will not be any change in the number of students. Probably we have to decide on the mode of evaluation as well. As I told you at the very beginning, so there will be a number of tests. It might be around 5-6 tests, and the weightage of this will be around 70 to 80%. And there will be another end semester test kind of a thing towards the end. So that will again be having a weightage of around 20 to 30%. Okay, so that the last quiz or last test will happen towards the end. So we'll have time for that. But for the other tests that we'll be conducting, so we'll have to be prepared. Maybe from next week itself, we'll be having the first set of quizzes or first set of tests. So I'll announce the date. We have 3 classes next week. Probably, I think 26th is a holiday. 26th, of course, is 26th is Sunday probably. No, not Sunday. 26th is a holiday, but let me see the calendar. 26th is a, oh yeah, that doesn't make any difference. 27, 28, and 29, we have 3 days. So on one of the days, we'll be having the first test for this course. And similarly, we'll be having around 4-5 tests. So I'll try to have a schedule for this test, which will be followed by the final test. So we'll try to find out the dates for this. The first quiz or first test I am trying to have next week itself, maybe next Friday. So because we'll have to wind up everything in April 21st or 22nd, something like that. So in that case, within February and March, we have to complete the rest of the test. So that is why I'm planning to have the next quiz, the first quiz of the series next week. It will be mostly in MS Teams form, and it will be for maybe around 15 to 20 minutes time. Marks will be around 15 marks, the details of which will be shared to you within a couple of days time. But please mark the date. Maybe on Friday next, we'll be having the first quiz. Okay. Well, if you have any other question, anything to discuss or share.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, so the quizzes will be for on the best of 5 format, or will it be like just 5 quizzes?
No, it is something like that, best of 5 kind of a thing. So what I'll be having, if I have around 80% as the weightage for the quizzes, then probably so the quizzes will be comprising of 20 marks, having 20 marks, and then in that case we might be having 5 quizzes. The best 4 out of these 5 will be taken into consideration.
Okay.
Hmm? It's okay then. If you don't have any other question, then let me stop here today, and we'll meet next week. Okay. Thank you.